Hello, welcome to the first ever Black Tot Rum Club. My name is Mitch Wilson from Black Tot Rum, and today we are going to be introducing my favorite rum writer in the world, Mr. Matt Pietrek. Rum lovers everywhere may know him more as the voice behind CocktailWonkcom, also the author of Minimalist Tiki, and as of this week, once again, a nominee of Tales of the Cocktail for 3 awards this week, I believe, Matt. Yeah?
Yes. Wow, that's right, but yes.
Well done. Congratulations. So welcome to the show, Matt.
Thank you.
For those of you joining us for the first time, well, yes, everyone's joining us for the first time because we've never done this before. The premise of this, of having a rum club, if anyone has been to rum clubs before, rum clubs are a social gathering of rum lovers around the world. I remember my first one was at Trailer Happiness here in London, in Notting Hill. I've been to ones in Sydney, Paris, all over the place where different rum clubs are being held and rum lovers are getting together and learning more about the rum. And rather than this being about the brand of Black Tot, what I wanted to do is, whilst we're unable to travel and bring you the rum personally, we want to sort of delve a bit behind the scenes and ask some of the rum experts in the world, like Mr. Pietrek, what's really going on in the rum world? Because whether you're new to rum or a pro at rum, you'll know that the rum world can be misleading at best. There's some murky waters there. There's some downright lies a lot of the time. So what we're going to do is each month we're going to explore different topics of rum in these rum clubs. And this month we thought it was fitting to start off with Navy Rum because that's very much our heritage at Black Tot, and I thought there's no one better to speak to than Matt Pietrek. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure. It's nice to actually talk about these things more in public instead of a lot of sort of these behind the scenes conversations. Mitch and I have been having about Navy Rum. So.
Yeah, it's been. I've been picking Matt's brain over the last few months and trying to find out all his secrets. And every now and then he'll let me have one or two. But it's been a really fascinating journey. And I think Keegan's watching there. Keegan said we need more rum, so let's have a little shot of rum together. Hi everyone. Hi to everyone who's tuning in. Whatever you've got, pour it. Enjoy. Cheers.
Cheers.
Hi Dwayne.
Yes.
Hi Drew.
There's Jamaican rum in here.
Oh, delicious. So Matt, look, where to start? I guess to put a bit of background into our relationship. Obviously, we've known each other for the last couple of years now, maybe even slightly over. And I've always looked up to Matt for his rum writing. CocktailWonk was, for me, especially starting as a rum ambassador, was such a great reference tool, because if it was, if I was looking at islands or styles that I didn't deal with personally, I still wanted to be an expert on them and still be able to talk about all those differences. And what is the difference between Cachaça, Agricole, and Clarion? And what is the difference? What is that AOC in English anyway? All those kind of things. And Matt's done such a great job of writing those articles. So I guess just to start off with, Matt, for people who might not be as familiar with your work yet, what got you into the rum game? How did that journey start?
Yeah, great question. I'd say it's the same way a lot of people have gotten into rum, through tiki. It was around 2007. My wife, Carrie, who's now the co-author of the book, bought me one of the Jeff Berry books, and we had plenty of time to read it and study it while we were waiting for our house to be finished renovating. And as soon as it was done, we had a little bar area, and I started making all the recipes, and rapidly discovered, like, I don't see Demerara rum in the grocery store, and I can't find a good Jamaican rum. And so, in the time, there wasn't a whole lot of great information about it. So I started digging, and a few years later, it's like, oh, it's time to start writing, and it sort of became an obsession that's taken over my life, to be honest. So.
And that's one of the interesting things, isn't it? It's like there's so much information out there, but so much of it is either not true or misleading. And like, I think, we've had a few conversations about this, like the number of articles that pop up every couple of weeks. And it's like, here's a new white, gold, and dark rum. And you're like, oh, God, like what a shit way to describe spirits. It's like any spirit, not just rum. But you'd be forgiven if it wasn't your world, if it wasn't your life, if it wasn't something you were doing every day. You'd have to do a little digging to actually find out what's going on, and depending on which website pops up first is going to completely color your view of rum.
Correct. Yes.
So.
Yeah, and I think to some extent my approach is based on what I did in technology for 30 years, where it was sort of like there were unambiguous truths, like things either work or they don't work, and you can understand things if you dig deep enough, and so that perspective sort of colored my approach, and ask questions. Do they make sense? Does the answers make sense? Do other people agree the answers make sense? Does what I see line up with what they say? And so I just I'm the person who really wants to understand everything, and and eventually I learned how to get people to share information with me. And now I want to share that with other people so that more people can enjoy rum and not have to go through all the work I've done to get to this level of understanding.
And yeah, I mean, that's such a good point. And I think because your background was writing technical manuals, right? And being able to take people from sort of zero to hero of understanding with very complicated computer programs. And it feels very much like that has come across to your rum. Like you can take something like Jamaican esters and marks and all these very obscure things, which 10 years ago most people would never have even heard of, and now it's like you've got all us rum nerds are like, what mark is in this one? How many esters is it? Like what are the volatiles?
I mean, and my university background was in physics, and the whole notion of physics is if you break it down and keep breaking it down and understand it, eventually you can understand just about everything. And so there was never that like, well, I give up, we don't know. Like it's like, no, we just need to work harder to tease out these details. And like, well, what is flavor? Well, it has to be some sort of chemical. So organic chemistry, like, well, let's go learn about that. So.
just as a hobby, just as a pastime.
Not PhD level, but enough to where it's not a mystery, and where you can smell bullshit if somebody's feeding it to you.
For sure. And I guess that's one of the things which I'm quite excited to tackle in the Rum Club and with yourself tonight and over our next few sessions, sort of looking beneath that veneer of some of those well-told tales and asking, what's really going on. And sometimes the truth is a bit inconvenient, like you're running a brand, you've got your story, you've told that story 100 times, and then suddenly you find out, maybe it wasn't quite how I thought it was, or this happened. And
yeah.
There's often a lot more gray areas than we realize. So I guess starting with that then, obviously, as I say, we're talking about Navy Rum, and some of you may know Matt's been writing a book on Navy Rum over these past 12 months now.
Well, I started it at the end of 2018, and for the most part wrapped up all the serious writing in about 7 or 8 months. Now it's with the Ferran people who are laying it out, and COVID has slowed things down, and just the world slows things down. But I have handed them a substantial amount of work that will appear as a book at some point.
Fantastic. And I guess that's really where our journey starts. What is a Navy Rum? Because I think most rum lovers would have a reasonable conception. Navy Rum is this, Navy Rum is that. But you try and look for one definition, and even when I get close to thinking, oh, I know what Navy Rum is now, then something else happens, and you find out some other piece of information. So can you answer what is a Navy Rum?
Yeah. So as you alluded to, there is no one single answer, and that it evolved substantially over time. That the Navy, the rum that the sailors were drinking as early as 1655, was not at all the same rum that they were drinking in 1970. And when you really get into it and you look at how did it evolve, you start seeing geopolitics and the colonial era and things like beet sugar or just all sorts of history dramatically influenced what was Navy rum over the time, and even between 1790 and 1810, even those 20 years, I believe we saw a pretty drastic change in how the British Navy created the rum for their sailors. And it's a really challenging topic to tease apart because you only see little bits and pieces of it, maybe in tax excise records or admiralty notes or whatever. So it's fascinating to try to tease out these little bits of information and then assemble them in a coherent narrative. And I said it has changed a bit over the time, but if you were to say, what was take 100 years, say the last 100 years of British Navy rum, I would say it's a blend of young rums brought to London or a couple of other victualling yards in the UK that was blended in vats for a couple of years and reduced down to Navy strength and sent out to the fleet.
So young rums brought to London, blended in vats, brought down to Navy proof, sent out to the fleet. So on that, I suppose one of the first questions I'd have is, where is that rum coming from? Because this seems to get argued about all the time on the rum forums. Like, oh, this rum's only Trinidad. This rum's Trinidad and Guyana. This one's got some of this country in. This comes like. What is it? Is it one country? Is it a blend of countries? Right. Where are we defining and drawing that line in the sand?
Right. Now I would say some of the challenge there is that in the 20th century, the idea of brands, saying like Caroni Navy Rum or Lemonheart Navy Rum or what have you, they did something approximating Navy rum, but they tended to be a single country. And I would say, their notion of Navy rum is what most consumers, believe to be, a Navy rum. The reality is that the rums that the Navy were buying changed substantially over time, and that they were impacted by geopolitical events. For example, one of my favorite stories is that we'd like to think that the British Navy rums, at least towards the end, were a blend of rums from the former then the British colonies. The Guyana, Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad is always I call that the quartet. It always get mentioned, but the reality is that there was probably very little Jamaican rum in the Navy blend for the last 100 years or so, and that for example, in the middle of World War II, the predominant source of rum for the rums that were blended in 1944 came from Cuba. Again, a result of geopolitical things, the war. In that particular case, the British colonies couldn't supply enough rum for the British Navy, and the Admiralty had to go looking for rum from elsewhere. And Cuba was their best bet. And interestingly, they were rather adamant about trying to get a Cuban rum rather than having to take a Jamaican rum at that point in time. So I think some Jamaican did actually go into there, but again, it's the notion of there was a preferred blend and a preferred flavor profile, but it had to adapt as the times changed.
And okay, so we're saying now that there's Cuban rum in the Navy rum blend. Is that
there was, yes. That I have an extensive portfolio of documents between basically the Cuban government, the British Admiralty, the British, I think, Foreign Services, the American Foreign Service, or the American Foreign Services, and because they were involved in this, and Edie and F Man. It was a long running for over the course of like 6 or 8 months of like we're desperately like we need this rum. Like they needed to meet their rum ration requirements. Like we needed, I think it was something like 3.5 million gallons of rum were needed, and they had grabbed everything they could from the colonies, and they were even talk of like basically forcing some of the British merchants who had aged rum, basically if they were thinking of forcing some of them to actually sell their aged stocks to meet their needs. But in the end, they said they made a contract with a Cuban company to buy rum, and then the Cuban government got involved, and then the Americans got involved, and it's a fascinating story. And and Cuban was number 1 rum at that year, but the number 2 purchased rum was actually from Martinique. Very likely not an agricole rum as we know them today. Very likely a molasses rum, but still, in that year, the purchase records indicate that the number 1 rum purchased was Cuban rum, and the number 2 purchased rum was a Martinique rum. So, again, it just shows that as the times changed, the Admiralty had to adjust to those times.
And molasses Martinique rum. So we're saying there's no agricole in those Mai Tais.
Well, so that's actually a great conversation. I know Martin Cade has an opinion. I know Jeff Berry has an opinion. We think of this story as the story's now told. So agricole came about in the 1870s in Martinique, and cane juice rum really took hold there, but it was still not the dominant form of rum making in Martinique until the mid 1950s or so, 40s, 50s, whatever. But molasses rum was still very much of a thing in Martinique, who was a very large producer, and people don't realize that.
Fantastic. It's one of my favorite tiki cocktail arguments.
No, for sure. I mean, the reality is that the agricole only came into the Mai Tai after they ran out of the Wray and Nephew, and so that was entirely a decision of Trader Vic. So
wonderful. So, okay, so let's take this back a step, because for people who might not be as familiar with Navy rum historically and may have only seen Navy rum in terms of the modern day interpretations of it. It's a very interesting story how it came about, and for me, this is such a fascinating part of rum history, because it's changed forever the way that rum is put together. Like I think as a bartender, I grew up thinking, well, the pioneers of rum blending were Trader Vic and Don the Beachcomber, the tiki godfathers who put these rums together and created something bigger than the sum of its parts. And actually now, the more, after reading your book and seeing what's coming out, it's, actually this rum blending was happening 100, 150 years beforehand. And right. In a way that the world has never seen, and no other spirit has ever seen as well. Like there are now a couple of world whiskey blends and world, I don't know if there's a world gin blend yet, but probably, there's enough gins out there, I'm sure. But rum historically has been always a blend of various different countries, various different flavor profiles, and partly for economics, partly for flavor in certain instances. So how did that rum blends first begin? What was that tipping point where they decided, right, let's get all the rum together in one place and blend all these countries in?
So that's a really great question that I have a lot of data on, but there's still a few dots missing on the timeline. So what I'm able to find is that from the time that the British Navy started issuing rum up until around 1800, they were, for the most part, contracting out to various merchants to supply the fleet with an entire set of provisions. Like, we want you to supply, bread, bacon, tack, all these things. Like basically, like we're paying you this money to supply all these things to the British ships, and that includes rum. And in that era, that would have been, the merchants, the provisioning companies basically buying, Jamaican rum that came in, or Demerara rum, or whatever it is that came in. They would have, they were treated as commodity cask, and like, so you had 10,000 cask, and you would sell them or do whatever you wanted with them. There's no evidence that they were making multi-island blends in that sort of early era that I've seen, at least. But around 1800 or so, you start seeing the British Navy in their victualling yards, which the victualling yards predated the 1800s, but the idea of, like, it appears that all the rum started having to come to London, Plymouth, or Portsmouth, where it was presumably put in vats. Like, we have evidence that there was vatting, by the late 1880s. We don't have it as much in the the early 1800s. So we have a whole bunch of data points, and we can put them on sort of a timeline, but we have to be careful not to make too many assumptions about, well, if there were vats in 1880, well, then were there vats in in 1800? As a historian, you have to ask these hard questions. But definitely what we saw about the early 1800s was the Admiralty purchasing rum to be brought to one place. Presumably they were vatted, not just sort of resent out, the individual cask resent out. Interesting fact is that as late as 1805 or so, the British Navy didn't really care if it was West Indies rum or what they call foreign cognac, which would have been French brandy for the most part. In fact, I think it was 1805, the British Navy purchased more cognac more French brandy than they purchased rum.
What an outrage!
Yeah. I mean, the thing you have to consider is cost. Cost is important, and if you think about it, the cost of bringing over brandy across the English Channel versus rum coming all the way from the colonies, it's a substantial additional cost to do so. Lost cask, paying this. It took something like 2 months, 2 or 3 months, depending, for a cask to arrive back from the colonies to England. The French brandy across the Channel, was had a substantial price advantage.
And I guess also as well, there would have been another connotation with that, with England's long-standing rivalry with France.
Right.
At some points, not wanting to necessarily purchase off them or not being able to.
Right.
As well.
Yeah. So there was interesting is, this was in the middle of that sort of Napoleonic War era. And, I brought up the point of, like, well, where would they, how would, why, I don't believe the British would be directly trading with the French. And then I think it was David Wondrich, who's another historian, good friend of mine, and he mentioned the notion of what they call foreign flags. Basically, you go through an intermediate country to come over. So, like, France might sell it to, I don't know, say making it up, but like Spain, and then Spain would ship it over.
Yes.
So, and again, this is something where I'm trying to find exact evidence of that this happened or didn't happen. But it seems to be the most logical theory. But around 1806, 1807, a group of the British merchants, the same sort of characters behind the West India docks, I believe, were able to pressure the Admiralty to strongly prefer rum, and unless something else was substantially cheaper.
Clearly, they had very good taste.
They did.
Guys, if you're watching along as well, we can see a few of you commenting and saying hello. Obviously, Matt and I were talking about this before. This is one of the weirdest experiences ever, where we are just talking at ourselves at a computer screen. So if you're there, if you want to say hello, if you've got any questions for Matt as well, please make sure you put them in the comments. We'll throw them up here on the screen as well. We've got the wonderful Chanel Licori is managing all of this beautiful broadcast for us today and making everything work. So hey, Chanel. So thank you very much to Chanel. This would be much harder and much less professional without her here, as all situations I find. So okay, so we've got the start, and we've got rum first being brought in, the French brandy being brought, but then rum becoming the preferred spirit. Josh asks as well, I can see, were they buying any Spanish brandy as well?
Yeah, I mean, entirely possible. The contracts, basically, the British Navy for a while, it's very helpful for me, but the British Navy for a while had the, I don't know if it was a requirement, but they would post basically contract bids in newspapers, basically saying, yea, verily, we're on this date, we're going to take bids to supply us with this much rum or this much brandy. Everybody submit their bids, and we'll decide what we want to buy. The wording on those announcements of bidding simply said foreign brandy. So yeah, it's entirely possible it was Spanish brandy. It's entirely possible it was French brandy going through Spain. Don't really know. And I have some contracts or some records, some ledgers from that era, and unfortunately their propensity for very, very tight record keeping on this rum was from here, or that or that rum was from there, or that brand was from there, is very loose. Like if you were lucky, Jamaica and Demerara might be called out because they were Jamaica in particular was highly valued, but otherwise it was like Leeward Islands rum with no notion of Grenada or Barbados or whatever. So they didn't keep they themselves didn't have a strong need to know the exact terroir of the rum at that era.
And so I guess coming back to the blend itself, we talked about some of the countries it's come from, about the different spirits available to the Navy. But let's just, can we break down the mechanics of the vats themselves? How are they putting that rum together? How are they blending it? What was what did they build?
So yeah, the earliest records I have of the vatting, or sort of known records for the vatting system, appear around the late 1800s, and essentially what they described, and I think actually, are you able to pull up the picture for that, or the
from the one you sent me before?
Yeah, the one I sent you earlier.
Absolutely. 1 second.
Sometimes I try to let history speak for itself. So not that next one.
Next one.
Yes, here we go. Go back one.
Back one. Here we go.
There we go. So there it goes. And preparation of rum for the Royal Navy involves keeping a very large stock. As it arrives from the contractors, those contractors would be names you would recognize, like Lemonheart and Sons or Alfred Lamb of Lamb's Navy Rum. Those contractors is poured into open vats. That's a very interesting notion right there, of an open vat rather than closed vat. Open vats are going to have a lot more evaporation.
And what would the angel share on an open vat be?
Yeah, exactly. And to a certain extent, that angel share is going to reduce the ABV. So they were going to bring the proof down anyhow. So it's not as big of a deal, but still, open vats are interesting. You'd be hard pressed to find somebody doing this today. And then allowed to flow from vat to vat for a period of 2 years. So it's not a Solera system at all, but it is that notion of that. If you think about it, a series of vats, and there's another document that talks about, I think they said 30 or 40 different vats of different sizes, and 30, 40 vats of different sizes, and flowing between them. It actually kind of brings to mind like Solera, of like there's always rum going into the vatting system, and then as they need the rum, they actually had a couple of vats that they would pull off rum to be put in the cask and sent out. And that rum would have been at a Navy issuing strength. But reading between the lines here, it seems like there was a series of vats, and there was always rum coming in on one end or one part, flowing between the vats for a couple of years, 2 years it says there, and then emerging at the other end, as rum was sent out to the fleet. So it's not a Solera as we traditionally know it, but it kind of has that notion of is that all the rums are blended with many different rums that might have arrived over a period of 2 years. So, and then if you flip to the next picture.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so this is a couple of the Navy vats in there, 4,391 gallons. These were the smaller vats that were there. The biggest vat, they said, was around, I think they said 32,000 gallons. And I think there's this great description that talks about how, like, you could get in a rowboat and row across it.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a lot of rum.
Yeah. I think in total it said 250,000 gallons of rum.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a big night out.
Yeah.
That's even bigger than some nights at trailer.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Almost.
And you can tell from the records and stuff, the Navy was going through around, depending on whether it was wartime or peacetime, 1 million gallons or 2 million, even 3 million in some cases. The Navy was going through a prodigious amount of rum every year.
Wow.
And again, this what I'm describing is the system in London. There were also vatting systems in 2 other victualling yards.
And so, okay, so if we've got 3 vatting systems going on, and Solera, not Solera, I mean, it's not the first time that a rum Solera has been confusing or not quite what we thought it was.
Mm-hmm.
So where was the Navy getting its rum from? If they had these 3 yards, was it just wherever the boats were docked, or?
So this is where you have, there was an era of British rum merchants. They were the ones who were bringing into rum, importing the rum, and as best we know, though that rum had to come, at least rum going into England at that time, had to be, any Caribbean rum had to go, basically first be imported into the West India dock. So go back to the first picture in that sequence.
To the first picture, 1 second. It's very advanced technology we're using here. We're
yeah. So this is the West India docks today. This is about those warehouses there are about 1/10 or 1/15 of the actual warehouse system there. These are the only surviving warehouses there. There was like I said, like 8 to 10 times more of these back from about 1800 on. These are not the actual rum warehouses. The rum houses, the rum was actually sort of across a little channel there, a thing called Rum Quay. But they looked somewhat like this, and so all the rum had to be brought into London and had to be offloaded at the West India docks. And it was owned by, again, people whose names you would recognize, like Alfred Lamb and Lemon Hart, and there's a few other names few other merchants whose names you might still see on a rum bottle. And then they would, of course, bid to supply the Navy with 10,000 gallons or 50,000 gallons. The Navy would sample the rum, try it all out, say, okay, we'll take 10,000 gallons of this from you and 20,000 gallons from you, and we have newspaper records of that saying, on this date, this firm supplied this much and this firm supplied this much.
So are we saying now that there wasn't just one main broker to the Navy?
Yeah, so that's another sort of fascinating part of my research is there's a firm called ED&F Man. They're still around today. They're still there in London on the not far from the Thames, I believe. But now they're sort of a massive commodities trader, among other things. And they still do a lot with sugar and things like that. But their claim is that a certain James Mann in 1784 started supplying the British Navy with rum, and he held that contract for all the way till 1970. So what I do know is that at least from about 1910 forward, maybe even as back to like 1880. Like definitely, yes, the British Navy was using ED&F Man. I have records that yes, ED&F Man, the Navy said ED&F Man is our sole broker. However, if you go back further, you see no reference. I've yet to see any reference from the early 1800s, late 1700s of ED&F Man being involved. I have page after page of ledger notebooks saying, we bought from this firm and this firm and this firm and this firm, and ED&F Man does not appear in there at all. So I've gone to ED&F Man and I've said, do you have any evidence that can, support this claim? And they have not been able to come up with anything. So, maybe there's some level of misunderstanding in terms of what was meant by exclusive broker, but as I said, we have plenty of evidence that the British Admiralty was buying rum from lots of different sources prior to around 1900.
It's amazing to think that even 100 years ago, marketing maybe was embellishing their claims somewhat.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's funny. Like, I don't actually know when they said they were exclusive broker. Now that certainly they do so now, but I don't know when that claim came about. But interestingly, ED&F Man, like I said, is still a major commodities broker, and they still supply molasses to Caribbean distilleries.
I was randomly on the ED&F Man website earlier, just to say, I just wonder if there's any more rum going out, just in case.
They ended their rum department, obviously around 1970 when the Black Tot came about, but had to basically sort of reopen it a little bit for a certain other brand a few years later. So there's a lot more recent history that again I'm trying to tease out. So can't feel all of that, but a lot of history I'm doing is actually last 50 years and not 200 years ago.
So Keegan asks a wonderful question here, which is brings us nicely onto a very big mathematical equation. Keegan's heard that Navy proof served on ship was not 57. Now, this is something which I remember as a bartender being told, Navy rum is 57, or it's 54, or it's 54 and a half, or 50. What is Navy strength?
Yes. So what we do know, the most conclusive source is the British Navy itself, who in 1966 answered a series of questions from a writer, and basically answered the questions and put forth a stunningly useful and detailed account of the British Navy rum up to that point in time. And what they said was, in 1866, the Navy issuing strength was set at 4.5 degrees under proof. So that would mean 4.5% less than proof, which is, I'm sure we'll talk about in a moment. If you did the math in today's terminology, that would be 54.5% ABV. They say prior to that, we don't know. Contrary to any other evidence that we may come across, we believe it may have been issued at proof, but they don't actually know. All they know is that in 1866, somebody laid down it was 4.5 degrees under proof. So for the last 104 years, Navy issuing strength was 54.5% ABV. Okay,
so let's just break that down a step back, because not everyone might be a super rum nerd / mathematician. Okay, so first of all, let's look at proof. You've got the English proof, which is 57.15% ABV. Okay. We've got US proof, which is 50% ABV. So this at this time was different.
No. So here's how I describe it like this: is the comparing British proof and American proof is like comparing apples to cars. Like they're attempting to do two different things. The American definition of proof, which has been around for, I think, around 200 years, somewhere in there. The American definition of proof is 2 times the percentage of alcohol by volume. So if you have something that's 40% alcohol by volume, American proof is 80. So that's a very simple notion, 2x, 2 times. And as far as I've ever seen, no definition of overproof or underproof in this American system. The British proof system hinges around this notion of proof, and and there are long, like 300-400 years back, there's a definite connection of proof to lighting gunpowder on fire. Like you put grains of gunpowder in the spirit, if it ignites, or if it emits a loud bang, then that's proof that it that is strong enough. That system
is not true.
So I mean, that was a methodology that was used early on, and so that that's where that idea came around of like, this is proof. And it turns out, and the actual definition of proof from about 1810 on, somewhere in those days, was essentially the result of adding 13 parts of pure alcohol to 12 parts water, something like that. I posted the exact definition, parliamentary definition, in my rum history Facebook group. But there was some notion of like, this is what proof means. But what we, in today's terminology, what we would call a proof spirit is a spirit that is at 57.15% ABV. So like, proof is sort of like the center of the universe. It's the reference point. And then overproof or underproof is relative to that. Something, an overproof rum is more than 57%. An underproof rum is less than 57%. So that's the first thing to understand. And then if you wanted to specify the strength of a rum, they weren't using ABV then. If you wanted to specify strength, you would say 10 degrees over proof, which would mean 10 degrees over proof would mean 10% more than proof. And again, there's no ABV notion here. It's 10% more than proof. So 10% of 57% is 5.7%. So if you took 57% plus 5.7% more, you get 62.2, I think, whatever the math is there. That's what that overproof or underproof are, percentages relative to 57%.
So for everyone listening at home whose heads just exploded, and
it's really simple once you wrap your head around it.
So this was one of the interesting things that I remember reading in one of your articles, Matt, where you were saying anytime you see the degrees symbol, just think a percentage of.
Right.
And a lot of these old labels sort of have 70 degrees, and it's a percentage of the proof, which completely changes so much of it, because so many times we see a bottle of something and it says 70 with a little degree, and people go, that's only 35% ABV. How do you even call that rum?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and then the trick is when you think 70 degrees, 70%, don't think ABV. Put ABV out of your mind. Think about percentage of 57%, which I know is an ABV.
Good question here. So what is the benefit or use of the American proof system if they already had ABV? Why did you not just use ABV directly?
So ABV, to my understanding, ABV was not a generally worldwide recognized thing back then. There was something called the Guy, I'm probably going to butcher it, the pronunciation, like the Gay-Lussac scale, I think it was. So like you would see in contracts, for example, that you need something at like 100 Gay-Lussac, which is, I believe, the French system. The French were basically measuring alcohol by volume, but for whatever reason, the British didn't use that. The British did their own thing. The imperial gallon and all those sort of things.
Who needs decimals anyway?
Yeah, exactly.
Metric system's overrated.
Right.
So let's move on then. So we've talked a lot about Navy proof, and It's worth noting as well, anyone who's wanting to read more on this, if you haven't seen Matt's writing before on CocktailWonkcom, go and check it out. It's some of the best rum writing there is out there. Check out the website. Honestly, it's such a great rum resource, and it's usually the first port of call after a training I do, where I'm talking about esters or anything where it starts to get really complex and you just kind of need to see it written out. Go to the website. Chances are Matt's written an article on it. So
I tried.
Very, very handy. Thank you for making all our lives easier as rum ambassadors, by the way, as well.
Thank you.
The next section I want to go into with you, we touched on it there actually, but the gunpowder test. Now, I remember being told as a bartender, every time you want to check the ABV, you lit it on fire, put it on fire. But then turns out there's these things called hydrometers, which sound much safer,
right,
and would have had much less explosions. So when did hydrometers come onto the scene?
Right. Yeah. So this is one of those things of like marketing starts telling you a story and it gets repeated over and over and over again. Some of the
better story than a hydrometer.
So one of the stories, is basically, and I actually just posted about this on Rum History. But the story is like, well, the British Navy was like lighting gunpowder on fire with their rum every day until the Sykes hydrometer came around in like 1816, and yea, verily, that was it from that point forward. The reality is that I have no evidence that testing the strength of the rum was done every day on British Navy ships. That I have many different accounts of the ration ceremony, and none of them talk about this. I believe the assumption was that in general, the British Navy sent it out, the Admiralty, the victualling yard sent it out at the correct strength, and that the purser didn't screw with it. And that rum tub was supposedly kept under lock and key, and so nobody could mess with it. Is it possible that at some point somebody did the test out at sea? Sure, but I don't see any strong evidence that was a regular part of it. So that said, the Sykes hydrometer was actually invented around 1804, 1805. He died shortly thereafter, but his family sort of continued with it, and by around 1816, the British government adopted it. However, the Sykes hydrometer was an improvement on a previous hydrometer called Clark's hydrometer, and that goes back to around 1740. It was similar to the Sykes. It was like a series of weights that you would put on a rod, and it would basically, you put it into a measuring tube, and depending on whether the rod sank or rose or floated or whatever, you would, depending on the weights you had on there, that would tell you, an approximation of the strength. At some point, I read somewhere that at some point the Clark's hydrometer, when you're trying to account for all these things like the temperature and all these other things that are at play, that some of the Clark's hydrometers came with like 300 different weights to try to approximate all these things. But the Sykes hydrometer was a substantial improvement on that, much simpler. Basically replaced it. In fact, the Sykes hydrometer came about as a competition to come up with something better than the Clark's hydrometer. But we definitely have evidence that the British military, even in the U.S. in 1775 or so, which would have been, our American Revolution, the beginning of that, that the British military there received casks of rum and the hydrometer to verify its strength. So, there's the British, the British excise system, never let a penny, go to waste, or never let somebody get away with not paying, a penny, less in taxes. And there's no reason to believe that the British military was unaware of this thing that the rest of the country's taxation infrastructure was based on.
Now, you touch on an interesting point there, but I thought the whole point of checking ABV was to make sure that you weren't getting gypped when you ordered a nuclear daiquiri. You make thirsty bartenders going, is this Ray full 63? What are we doing?
Again, there's not a whole lot of reference that I see to like making sure that seamen didn't get their the sailors didn't get enough rum. And that particular topic doesn't come up, but the topic of hydrometers and alcohol by volume, or percentage of alcohol and strength and taxes, is just all over the place. I mean, it's so much of the information I glean is actually little tidbits, on the side of taxation records, taxation discussions in Parliament, for example.
And that is one of the interesting things. Like, so we've just posted up the links to the Rum History group for anyone who's interested in reading more into some of the amazing articles and the research that Matt and a few other rum aficionados have been finding. But there's some fascinating records there, and it's interesting because most of the details and the information, the actual rum history you're finding, as you say, is to do with not from bartenders, not from rum lovers. It's from tax officers making sure that they get paid their due,
Right.
and that. Yeah. And so many of the rules of rum seem to come from that as well, right?
Right. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I'd say a lot of my record, British parliamentary records are great because they're all there. Like this is like so much of the rum history we have may have been lost over time, but the British parliamentary records are preserved and saved, and you always run into that the issue of like this is the data I have, so it flavors the story I'm telling, and you're like, well, what is the information I don't have, and might it lead me to tell a different story? But yeah, like I said, the British government was very practical about managing all of these things, and it wasn't just sea captains making it up on the spot.
So coming on next, then one of the most interesting things. So I was very lucky to read one of the drafts of your book, which is coming out later on in the year, and I'm very, very excited. It was between yourself and Paul McFadden, you managed to get me a copy of this. And it was such a fascinating read because it really challenged a lot of the preconceptions which I had about Navy rum, and certainly when I came in, when I started with Black Tot, I thought I knew much more about Navy rum than I actually did.
Mm-hmm. And
then when I read your book, I realized I knew almost nothing. And then
neither did I. So I started. So.
And it seems every week that goes by, there's something new where I'm like, oh, okay.
Yeah, same here.
Something new to factor in.
Yeah.
But it's quite a tricky thing. But one of the chapters that interested me, because I think one of the, other than Navy rum as a misnomer itself, and being used in a variety of different circumstances, almost like Demerara sugar, like
right.
a general term for something that kind of tastes like this.
Right.
Another term which I see sort of used interchangeably quite a lot is London Dock Rums versus Navy rum. And we've already said, the rum is coming into, potentially London, but also other ports as well. So what is the main difference between a London Dock Rum and a Navy rum?
Right. So I would say it's a matter of the beginning stages were the same. These were young rums from the colonies. The colonies were not sitting on these casks and aging them to 5 years and then shipping them off to London. They were made, they were put in a cask, and they were sent off. So yes, there was some aging that happened, while it was waiting to be picked up or while it was, in transport. Some aging that happened there. Alexander Gabriel calls it dynamic aging, and they're doing research on that. But these were young rums came into the UK. Presumably, they were sold relatively quickly to the Admiralty, which threw them in vats. That's different from the true London Dock rums, I'm trying to think who it would be. White. I'm drawing a blank on a name, but one of the earliest records of what we see like London Dock Rum or from around 1860, 1870, mentioning London Dock rums, for sale, and those rums would have gone into the West India docks, which the Rum Quay, Quay, Rum Quay section of the West India docks, and then they would have aged for some number of years, maybe 2 years. We have one example that points to a cask that was in around 1890, I think, that had been in the West India docks for like 30 years. So those rums would have been doing what we would call continental aging today in the West India docks, and then when the merchants went to sell them, they would blend them however they wanted, blend them or not blend them however they wanted to, and sell them. So I'd like to say, like, the primary difference is that the London Dock rum would probably have more age in a cask, continental aging in a cask, and also wasn't necessarily going to be issued at Navy issuing strength.
So it's almost like almost the main rum versus sheer of today.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's that's, I never thought about an analogy, but exactly it. One is sort of like bulk rum, no attempt to do additional aging, in cask. The other is more boutique, smaller, cask aged rum for a much longer duration.
Fantastic. Oh, there we go. Deborah's saying, "What an expert."
Hi, Deb.
I'm to agree.
Good friend of me and Carrie, so good to see her.
So, I guess for our like final section, we've touched on some of the points here, but you wrote an article a few months back called "Setting the Record Straight on Navy Rum" and sort of dispelling some of the main myths that we know about it. So, what for you have been some of the revelations, if you like, some of the main things that you've come across that have maybe shocked you or surprised you, or just were completely contrary to what you believed at the start of this journey?
Right. I'm just thinking out loud here, but certainly the notion of Jamaican being a critical part of the British Navy rum was something I had written before. Like, well, yeah, of course it was Barbados, Jamaica, Trinidad, Guyana. The reality was that from at least 1880 on, several sources indicate, including, actually, go back to there's one more picture I want to show there.
So let me just throw that up 1 second.
Yeah, so this here is and it's a little truncated on the sides there, but there you go. This is an excerpt from the British Navy Victualling Manual of 1939, which I held in my hands at the British National Archives. But it says, it's very prescriptive of what it was. It says, Navy rum is purchased in the open market upon sample. This is the merchants I would talk about. Consists of a blend of West Indian, mainly Demerara and Trinidad. We have other sources which indicate that Demerara was typically around 60%. The Trinidad rum was around 30%. And that Trinidad rum, we know, was, at least some of it was from Caroni, because I've seen references not to say it was a Caroni rum, with proportions of Natal, which was part of South Africa. South Africa, there was like the colony still at the time, and Mauritius rum. That was also, these two were really surprising, Natal and Mauritius. You'll notice at this moment in time, there's no Jamaican, there's no Barbados. And then also it says Jamaican rum is rarely purchased as owing to its characteristic aromatic flavor. Its use would have a marked effect on the flavor of the blend to which the fleet has now become accustomed. Basically, the fleet had an expected flavor profile, and Jamaican rum was not that flavor profile.
I love the British description of Jamaican rum with its characteristic or aromatic flavor, as in it was so funky. It was funky.
Right. And now there's also another part of this document, but it actually then talks as well about how Jamaica, or the Navy rum, had actually 2 degrees of obscuration, which is a technical term for basically meaning like had additives in the form of caramel. And Today we think of caramel as like E150. It's very dark and a little goes a long way. If you were to flavor a rum with E150 or add enough E150 to a rum to affect the hydrometer percentage by 2%, it would be incredibly bitter. So, a theory is out there is that, okay, this caramel was not the E150 we know today, that it was maybe hadn't been burned as much, or may have been high, slightly higher sugar content. We don't know. This has, been a lot of, some intense speculation about this, but essentially what it's saying is the actual ABV that went out was actually slightly more than 54.5%. It was 55.7%, but the hydrometer would have read it at 54.5%. But regardless, there's a significant amount of caramel in there, and I think if you taste some of those old British Navy rums, you would get like a strong sort of a burnt sugar caramel note to it. I certainly taste that.
For sure, yeah. I mean, whenever we dip into the bottle of the last consignment here, you can like there's a lot going on there, and and that's one of the things we're getting at the moment is the chemical analyses for these to really go like what is going on here? Is it just rum, or is there other stuff going on as well? Because yeah, it's not like anything I've tried before, so it is very, very different.
Exactly. And there's speculation that it was Port Morant, and we know it, Port Morant still from Demerara distillers. We know more recently, yes, that was true. Like people will say, like, yes, we actually bought Port Morant rum, but I have evidence that at least as early as the 1940s that it was in fact Port Morant was specifically one of the marks purchased from Guyana.
So even then, they loved a double wooden bat still.
Yeah, exactly.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So we've got so many comments coming through. Again, please, if you've got any questions for Matt, please put them in the comments. We have no idea if you're enjoying it, if you're completely lost, if we're having a great time. So please let us know, because it's very weird talking at a computer screen for this length of time. We've been going over an hour now, so well done if you've stayed with the show. Okay, so and in terms of our blend, are we saying, I remember we looked at a video together where they had a blend, but it was very different to any Navy blend that I've seen before.
Right.
Are we saying there's a fixed recipe? Did it?
Yeah. I mean, it was. My assertion is that they tried to use it. They had a preferred flavor profile, and they knew what rums would match that flavor profile. But then they had to, like they do today, they had to, like you do today. If you buy from E&A Shear and maybe that rum's not available anymore, well, how do I swap in something else and blend to re-achieve that flavor profile? That's what they were doing. Like, the circumstances would change. Maybe Coroni rum was not available that year. How do we blend something else in? Try to
good question from Alison. What books would be best to read to learn more about rum?
Great question. Certainly, I mean, I would say it really depends on where your interest is. I think if you want to learn, like rum history, the two that always come to mind are the Ian Williams book, which I think is like 1776. I can't remember the name of the title. The Ian Williams.
It's a very light read, that book, isn't it?
Yes. Wayne Curtis sort of have that historical angle down. I think the Curious Bartender's Rum Revolution by Tristan Stevenson is a really good book. I think if you're looking for sort of a lighter, slightly lighter, but still good introduction to rum, Martin Cates, Smunger's Cove has some great discussion of rum in the context of, in the context of tiki drinks. And then, plug in my own work, the Minimalist Tiki book has about 50 pages on rum. I'm fairly confident, I would bet money that is the longest section on rum in the any cocktail book ever written. So I'm not saying most ever written.
It's been laid down.
Go to a cocktail book. It's got 50 pages. And talks about the brands and talks about who makes what and cheer and a little bit of the chemistry and the details of distillation and all that kind of stuff. So Johannes asked, when is your Navy Rum book coming? I wish I knew. Like I said, all the material has been delivered to Ferran. They have it there. I still communicate with them, and they're and they ask me the occasional question or do you have this, and they are working on it for layout, laying it out, but they've got other things going on too, and COVID certainly hasn't helped that. The possibility we'll see a preview at some point sooner rather than later. So I would love to see that. So
fantastic, yeah, and I can't wait to see the finished version as well, Matt. It's
me too.
such a good book, and I know, and Carrie obviously has been working on it with you and helping develop it.
Carrie has certainly edited all of my writing. She was with me in the British National Archives, trolling through the old documents and scanning them with me. So she knows far more about this than most rum nerds.
She seems like the most wonderful, understanding rum partner I've seen so far.
Yeah, so I knew that about Natal rum. So it was apparently it was really crap rum, at least at some point. There was some story about how it was the only rum that was brought to the ship and the captain tasted it and sent it back. I can't remember that reference, but Natal was a South African colony. It was not a whole lot of Natal rum. I have a feeling it was probably a desire to again support the colonies. Like they have a rum, they have a rum industry, and like, okay, we've got to buy local, meaning like buy British colony local. So, and that's literally just about all I know on that.
Fantastic. There's lots of different questions coming through. There's probably quite a few which will come back and we'll.
By the way, did you have those videos? We're going to play those videos.
Yeah, shall we show a couple of videos?
Yeah, show a couple of videos.
That's it. We don't know if the videos work on this, but let's see. We're testing this live. So, which one do you want to start on? Do you want the one where he drinks?
Which one is it?
The one where he's they're testing out the sailors on the HMS.
Oh yeah, the sailors in their underwear. Yeah, start with that one.
Let's begin here, and we'll show you a few little videos which we found.
Yeah. So, I'm going to duck out for just a second, but yeah, start that video. Love that one.
And let's see if we can get some. Oh, this isn't the. Here we go.
The daily rum ration was introduced in 1687. In those days, the sailors drank it neat. Then, in 1740, for better or worse, along came Admiral Vernon, who watered it down.
That's the breaker.
Known as grog. A good sailor is supposed to be able to knock it back in one go. He needs more practice. He'll get it, never fear. There you are.
Yes, It is. So I watched that video and I can't help but think like, okay, how much rum did they put in there, and how much was the guy, stirring with his arms, hairy arms submerged in there? I'm like, that's a lot of rum for 4 sailors there.
It's so for anyone watching, and I know I've spoken to Matt about this already, but a few months ago, I was lucky enough to be put in touch with an actual purser from the ships. So he used to actually give out the rum rations from 1961 till 1970. It's this wonderful character called John Hume. And he, for the last 3-4 months, has been sending me all these stories from, his days on the ships, giving out the rum and rationing it out, and how they used to steal the rum and get more of it. And we had a little test call the other day. It took about 10 minutes to find out where his video camera was so that we could actually get him up on screen. But he's very kindly agreed to be one of our guests. So if you're interested to hear some of those stories from the horse's mouth, so to speak, and what they're actually doing on the ships and all the things they didn't tell us, he's going to come on board.
Yeah, I know. I'm definitely watching that one. I did notice the question here. It says, is this video going to be saved so someone who missed it live can watch it? I believe that one's been posted up on Rum History. I got that one. Yeah, I got that one from the Imperial War Museum. If you really want the old pictures of ration ceremonies, the Imperial War Museum has a great archive. So I think I borrowed it from the Imperial War Museum and may have trimmed it for duration there. There's a lot of stuff unrelated to rum in there. I think there's a couple different videos I put up on the Rum History site. Pavel asked, what time daily was the rum ration served?
6 bells in the forenoon.
Yes, all that. Yes. So the interesting thing is that that actually changed quite a bit over the years as well. Sometimes there was just one ration ceremony, one issuance. Sometimes it was twice. The Navy spent a lot of time trying to fine tune, giving sailors their rum, but not having them sloshed all the time. And so the issuing strength. Or not the issuing strength, the issuing amount, basically the dilution, the amount of rum issued, the dilution of the rum was like constantly changing all the time, like every few years. The Navy document I found is a great sort of historical timeline of what changed there. There's this one great portfolio I found where they did a study to see whether sailors, because at the time the rum was diluted with 3 parts of water, and they did a study to see if sailors preferred it diluted with only 2 parts of water. To no great surprise, it was unanimously, yes, we like it with only 2 parts of water. But yes, but there was my recollection is that, and every ship could do it at slightly different times depending on circumstances. But my recollection is that it was typically around lunchtime. I think don't quote me if I'm wrong. Around lunchtime, because when there were 2 ceremonies, one was also at night, and I think in the evening. And I think the evening ones, the sailors were allowed to not have their rum diluted. So. And again, I have to go read my book to see what was true. Like this is just off the top of my head.
It's been very interesting speaking to John, who's going to be a guest for us in the next couple of weeks. But it's some of the stories that they did, and even little things like you saw in that video where everyone drinking it together, they had to drink it there and then to prove that they weren't storing the rum away and hiding it for later on, because rum was a bartering tool. It was like. Right. You could switch out rum for someone covering your shift. You could, give some to the chef for extra food. So it was a real currency on the ship,
right?
And one of the few ways that they could trade. So
right. Do you have any? What are the other videos you have there?
We've got this slightly longer one that you sent me. Let me share.
The Grilling Yard.
Let me start it off, and you can tell me if this is the right one.
Okay.
This guy?
Yeah. So scoot forward to around 6 minutes or so. Back. Keep going, back. Keep going, back. Keep going. No, stop, right there. Okay, start there.
All right.
Chops and steaks leave the store, cut to the correct size. I did say 74,000 gallons of rum earlier on, but that's not all. At the William Yard, they even make their own rum casks. This highly skilled work is still done by hand. With loving care, the coopers repair and remake empty casks returned by the Navy. When they're finished and polished, on goes a brass plate with a traditional "The Queen, God Bless Her" engraved on it. As for the hooch itself, it's blended at Rangerton. Navy issue rum, or Nelson's blood, is blended to a recipe almost as old as the Navy itself. Mr. Charlton explained it all to me.
When we get into about 40 over proof, our job is to put it into the vat and bring it down to 4.5 under proof, the strength we issue to the fleet.
How does that compare with the rum I would buy in a shop?
Well, the rum we buy in the shop, we've got 33 1/3 under proof. When we get the rum, we have at the moment 4 varieties: Demerara, Trinidad, Barbados, and Australian. The Navy have their own particular blend, which is 60% Demerara, 30% Trinidad, and 10% the Barbados, or 5% of Barbados or Australian. We put quantity into the vat. We know by experience now it's about 1,200 gallons to make our mix of 1,900 gallons when we add the water. We put into the vat, then we turn on the agitator, you can see it behind me, give it a good turnover for 3 or 4 hours. Then we take the strength of the mixture at the top of the vat and the bottom of the vat.
Yeah. There's a hydrometer.
The strengths agree. We know then the strength of our own mixture.
There's no gunpowder.
We then add the appropriate amount of water required, which we get from a formula that we want so many gallons of water to bring that rum down to the strength of 4.5 degrees under. We put the water in, put the agitator on again, give it another good turn up for 3 or 4 hours. Then we take a series of strength tests from top of the mixture and bottom of the mixture. And when we find that they're both 4.5, and we can't always get 4.5 exactly, but 4.3, 4.6, then we know the mixture is ready for issue to the fleet.
When you cask it?
And then we cask it, as you can see, on the cask under the taps. The one we either put in the Cure-de-Kins for big ships, which is 18-gallon cask, smaller ships, 10-gallon cask, or for submarines or small boats, we put it into 1-gallon jars.
And finally, the controlling nerve center. The machine room in the William Yard coordinates all the...
Yeah, so Pavel asked, the movie mentions Australia a few times. Just goes back to my point.
Navy
I know, right? It goes back to my point of the blend changed over time, depending on various circumstances. I think one of my friends, some of you probably friends with Steve Maggery, down in Australia. He's also
jumping out of his seat if he's watching this.
Yeah, but he's also a bit of a historian. We trade a lot of notes, and I think he found evidence that it would have been from the Inner Circle distillery, I think it was, or the brand was Inner Circle. I'd have to look at my notes, but basically, we have a good idea of what the Australian rum was. So that video is from 1966. And the little picture I showed you earlier from the Vittling manual is from 1939. We have, I have a good indication of what was rum in the blend in 1944. I have some parliamentary records from 1956, which indicate what went in the blend. So the key takeaway is, like, every time you look, it's changed somewhat. The relative constant is just the Demerara rum, and then when Trinidad sort of came online as a major producer in the early 1900s, and sort of Trinidad joined the blend, but those other smaller components seem to evolve over time, and we don't know the exact underlying reasons why, but this is the data we have. These are the points we have to try to fit to a curve, and so. In terms of somebody I'm sure will ask Barbados, and again, Barbados was not a major exporter of rum for at least not to the UK for like most of the 1800s. Barbados sort of really ramped up roughly around the time of the U.S. Prohibition, their rum industry sort of really ramped up there for export, and so the earliest sort of confirmed Barbados rum I've seen. You don't see, if I remember correctly, you don't see Barbados listed in 1939, but by 1944, you definitely see it in these other documents they have. Barbados was part of the blend. We know that would have been almost certainly from West Indies rum distillery. We don't think Mount Gay had a fire at some point somewhere. I think in the early 1940s, Mount Gay would have had a fire, and so they probably couldn't have supplied much of the way of export in that regard. So we're pretty sure it was West Indies, and I believe have to check, but I believe Andrew Hassel of West Indies Rum Distillery, his friend of mine, has found the records there, basically showing the sale of rum to basically to Edie and F. Mann, who then would have sold it, given it to the Admiralty. I think there's something else in there. And in fact, the West Indies Rum Distilleries, their second major still came around in 1945, and I believe, as Andrew has told me, that he's like anticipating future demand for like the British Navy, like they had to start it, at some point, like, okay, we think there's going to be a lot of demand here. The Navy wants more rum. And it finally came online in 1945, just as the war was ending. So, yeah,
that would have been a really upsetting investment, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
But hi, Sean.
And this is we're very lucky in this regard. Just to there are some people around, and there are some records around. Like, if you dig back far enough in like existing company records, you might find little tidbits of information that help you complete the picture. So.
And that's what's so interesting, I think, is like it's, we've now been talking for almost an hour and a half, and there's so many gray areas, there's so much nuance, there's always another layer to the story, and we've only just touched on the fact that Australia is now in the Navy rum mix. They brought it from halfway around the world, and
at least we can say Australia was in the blend in 1966. Beyond that, I would love to see more data points.
Absolutely. Well, maybe Steve, if he's watching, can send us some of those when he no doubt uncovers them all. So
yeah, for sure.
So I think that brings us to a lovely finishing point. If there's any more questions, that's a very good question. Was there a clear reason for stopping the daily rum?
Yes. Absolutely. The British Navy was no subject or no stranger to the temperance movement, even as far back as the late 1800s. I think I mentioned earlier that a lot of the Navy discussions were amongst the Admiralty, the decision makers were like, how do we stop doing this? Like, drunk sailors were a constant problem. What a lot of people don't realize is that you were given a ration, but you could also instead choose to take extra money. So if you didn't take the rum ration, you get extra money, and so there were certainly teetotaler sailors, and they always had the option of getting money instead. And then the temperance movement came around. Which kind of had its fad, if you will. But by the early 1900s, you started seeing evidence that the percentage of sailors who were taking the money rather than the rum started to grow. That instead of 98% of sailors taking the rum, over the years it'd be like 90%, 80%, 60%. So that by the 1960s, it was, I believe, less than half of the sailors were actually choosing the rum after that, choosing the rum rather than money. And, at some point it becomes the cost issue of like, hey, we're still making this rum, and, less and less sailors are taking it. And there was also, the the Navy had gone through a number of waves of like people pushing to try to end the ration, but in the late 1960s, I think the right people were in charge and finally pushed it across the line. In late '69 was when the vote was, and then the actual stopping was July 31st, 1970. The Black Tot Day. So. Yeah, the reason given at the time was essentially, reading the exact quote, but essentially, we are a modern Navy, and and we have things like aircraft carriers and cruise missiles, and having a drunk person at the helm of these weapon systems is dangerous.
And that was one of the first things I looked up as soon as I saw that quote saying, "Oh, the technological advancements have are very different to what they were in the past." And I remember looking up, like, when did they invent nuclear submarines? Yeah. And they invented them in 1958. So for 12 years, we argued, should we have nuclear submarines and rum? And the answer was yes. They still had it.
Right. I think the New Zealand had it. I think New Zealand still had the ration until I think 1991 or 92.
Yeah, New Zealand wins, and Chanel, who's hosting for us, is dancing in the background because she's very proud of the fact that her country was the last to give up the rum ration.
Yeah.
Someone told me that Canada still has rum on the boats. Is that true?
It's possible. Actually, I'm going to go off on a tangent there, but I had a great conversation with Rocky last year, obviously before he passed away. But he asserted that British Navy ships still had to have rum on board, that they would have had to have rum on board in case a splice to main brace call was issued. And I'm sure we'll talk about that. But essentially that, like, if the Queen decided to declare splice to main brace, well, they had to have rum on hand to issue it. And so like I don't think so. But I went off and did digging, and it turns out there actually is some like UK regulation, and it basically calls for, like, you can use whatever spirit you want now. It doesn't have to be rum. You use whatever spirit you want now, and they have a very prescribed amount that can be issued. But you do not have to have it diluted. So, fun little side discussion.
Absolutely, and that's another point that's going to come up, no doubt, with our purser, Mr. John Hume, when he joins us on the show. But like, that was one of the points he made straight away. He's like, there's still rum on all the ships, because if splice to the main brace is called, you legally have to have the rum there. And actually, another interesting point, which I know you'll appreciate him at, that he's divulged, was the flagons weren't just a means of transport or an easy way of accommodating smaller ships or the submarines, as the video said. But he said you had to store your rum and your food and all your supplies in several different points in the ship, because if one point got damaged or blown away, the last you had to have that supply duplicated somewhere else. So flagons were a good way of storing.
Yeah, that's true.
Extra little parcels of rum hidden around the ship. And presumably other things as well, but obviously rum was the most important.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, that's a good point. I never thought about that, but it certainly makes sense. And yeah, touching on the flagons, the evidence, again, the records I've seen point to, sometimes the rum was issued in casks, sometimes it was in flagons. I think the flagons came later on. But if you were a giant aircraft carrier, and being provisioned to go out to sea, and you needed to take on, say, 10,000 gallons of rum, you probably weren't going to get 10,000 flagons. You were 1 gallon flagons. You would have gotten, probably, I don't know, 200 casks or whatever, which you could then spread around. But on the other hand, if you were a nuclear submarine, you're not going to have room for these casks, and so you would get these flagons instead.
So I'm just putting up on the screen for anyone who might not have seen a flagon before. So these are the Navy rum flagons. that we first discovered. This is what started Black Tot off as well. But these are imperial gallon flagons, so 4.5 liters. This is them in wicker for protection. This is what they would look like underneath. And they would all be sealed with a little date on top. So here you can see the wax seal 1270 would refer to December 1970 here. They all come, they're not that easy to get to. They're all sort of sealed in these kind of boxes. These are all metal guarding tapes around, so they're all nailed shut. So you have to pry it open with a crowbar, and you sort of get something like this.
And by the way, I'll jump in really quick. Another little fun fact about these flagons, which is sort of interesting history digging, is the British Navy was not the only one who got rum. The other forces did as well. So there was actually Army rum and Navy rum, and by that point, both were in flagons.
Absolutely, and it's interesting hearing some of these stories. And again, this is another layer of nuance, another little gray area where it's like, well, at what point were these rum rations issued to the army? Like, at what point were they given to the Navy? At what point were they on shore? What part were they on ships? And all of this seems to break up. And one of the interesting things talking to John is, I said, well, do you know where the rum came from? Did you taste the rum? Where you go, oh yeah, there's some Jamaica in this one. It's like, no, I had no idea where the rum came from. It's just they just knew they had to have the rum.
Mm-hmm. Right, for sure. And the British Navy had their own flavor profile. We believe the Army was purchased, at least for some of the time, purchased their own rum and had their own blends around it as well. So it's possible maybe they had Jamaican in there. We don't know. And again, anytime you try to come up with this, like a concrete statement, you have to say, well, what about 20 years earlier or 50 years after that? So it's a challenge to try to tease all these things out, with so few data points.
Absolutely.
Corey asked, is there a difference between a flagon and a demijohn? I should know that. I don't know if there is. I mean, in my mind, they're the same idea, but I think traditionally I've seen demijohns as more like glass. I think of demijohn as like something you find in a cognac paradise type of thing, and a flagon is these stone things with a different shape. But if anybody else has a better answer, I would love to learn.
I think I'm going to be completely honest here, and I did what years of bartender training taught me, and I Googled that question quickly as Corey was asking it. And yeah, essentially it's a size related thing. I mean, in terms of storage, they both do the same job, but a flagon would be, the 4.5 liters or 1 imperial gallon that we talked about earlier, whereas a demijohn can go up to 16 gallons. So there's a bit of a size difference there, but you're right. I've only ever seen demijohns in cognac, so I don't know how widely they would have been used. Certainly, never heard it used in a Navy term.
Right. Yeah, that's not a term I've come across in my recollection.
And especially if they were being made of glass still, they wouldn't be any good on a ship.
Yeah, no. So Emiliano is asking about taxes. Sailing around the world with high-proof alcohol source was possible sailors for smuggling with Navy rum. Well, that was the job of the purser, if you will. They, like the Admiralty, knew very much how much rum they sent out with the ship, and they knew basically, they knew there were very good records kept on how much was issued every day. Like every day, they calculated who was eligible for a ration, who wasn't. Like if you were in the brig for some misbehavior, you might not get your ration. So there were very detailed records. There's another one of those videos. There's another video in there somewhere where it shows the person very diligently making records of stuff. But they knew exactly how much was issued every day, and they would knew when you came back to port, like, oh, well, here's how much rum is left. So they were doing the math. They were, they had accountants. They were doing the math, and a dishonest pusher would get found out eventually.
And this is again, I can't wait for the stories we're going to hear from the purser himself. There are so many creative ways in which rum was stolen.
Yes.
We're gonna learn all of those tips and tricks. And it was amazing because I was talking to him and like he was like, "You're not going to tell anyone, are you?" I'm like, "What do you mean?" He's like, well, "I'd get put in jail." I'm like, "I think you're okay now."
You're okay now. Yeah.
I think they're going to leave you alone now. You're an old man. But yeah.
So outrageous stories about Navy rum. The one that sort of comes to mind, which I added to the book at the last minute because I came across it last minute, and I've only seen one source of this, and so I hedge substantially on this because it seemed like what? There was one source that indicated at least at one period in time that they put in very finely chopped horsehair into the rum, and the idea was that it was sort of like a marker, if you will, in the same way that use like a dye marker to like an explosive today, like they put in dye markers or whatever, oh, this came from here. If you put in a very small amount of very finely chopped particles, if you took that rum and you held it up to a light, you would see these things. So you could say like, oh, the theory, as somebody explained it to me, was that if you suspected a purser was maybe selling his rum to to a local shop or whatever, if you went to that shop, bought the rum, and you held it up, and you see little bits of horsehair in there, that you would know, oh, this was actually Navy rum. That's the theory. I would love to have additional data points to back that up.
I think you might be about to get them, because that was one of the other interesting things that I was being told yesterday, but with my chat with John was, and I don't want to spoil the stories because you guys might tune in again next week. But
okay,
he was saying when you drank the rum, you had to grit your teeth because of all the stuff in the rum, and he said it was because they were mixing in the barrel and getting splinters and other in the rum. Like the rum wasn't filtered, but that story about the horsehair now adds another layer. It's like, and he said when you drank it, and this is why, when we watch that video of those 4 guys, and some of them are struggling to drink the rum, it's like if they're new and they haven't learned how to drink that would be a really good example of why. So we'll have to pick his brain next week when.
No, for sure. But then again, I mean, think about it, but you don't experience that in the flagons you've opened, no. I don't think.
That's very true. Yes. Yeah. So, again,
that's the fun part about history. Is you always have to learn something, and you have to say, "But could this not be true?" I mean, what other? Yeah, I love Carrie. It's like it's the forearm hair.
Yes, from all the churning. Probably, yeah.
I don't think of any other outrageous stories about rum, about Navy rum. So there was. I mean, I'll tie this in to I think it was Keegan's question. Keegan said something about somebody swimming in the rum vats. There's another great story which is in the book, and that these are in the victualling yards, and there were vats, these open vats where the rum was circulating, and I think this was around 1900 or so. But one of the superintendents had a small little dog or something like that, and it was always sort of like running around on the edge of the the vats or whatever, and then one day disappeared. And so they're like, oh, he probably fell in the vat and drowned, and it's too bad. But at some point, I don't know if they said, well, we're going to drain these vats to go look for it. Not that it would have done any good, or if it's just, oh, it's time to clean the vats, let's drain it. But regardless, at some point the vat got drained, and they kind of figured that they would find, a dog, or the bones of a dog, or whatever you would get in that high strength situation. No dog could be found. However, what they did find was a whole bunch of glass bottles with long pieces of string tied to them. And you're like, why would there be bottles with long pieces of string? And you realize it's because the victualling yard workers were, when boss is not around, basically, dip the bottle in, pull out your rum. And if, you either dropped it or more likely, the supervisor comes walking by, you just like let go of the string and the evidence is gone. So that's one of the, my sort of favorite stories in that regard.
Whatever it takes.
Yeah.
It's like bartenders behind a bar.
Yeah, exactly.
Always find a way. Has anyone found any old rum from the smuggling times from the coves or buried?
If there is, I've yet to have heard about it. I mean, being taking the romance out of it, I'd think that anything in the cask would have evaporated. Your angel share over 300 years, there would be nothing. So,
and I think you've got to remember as well. It's like they would have drunk it as fast as possible.
Oh yeah,
I don't think anyone was locking away a couple of flagons for storage at that time.
No.
If you can drink it, get on it.
Right.
Again, there are stories of the sailors would hide away some of their rum rations and save it for a day so that they could have a day off. But and there
were stories of like essentially like the way it was issued is there like a series of measures. Like I have a tiny little bit. This is a half gill measure. But basically, they had a series of different sizes of like a full gill and like a gallon and a half gallon that were basically used to measure out the amount of grog issued. And there were stories of like at some point it was done at the mess level of like, okay, there's 30 people, 30 officers of this level. They all are messed together, basically eat together. Their dining hall. And so the rum, was collected up at the deck where they did the initial mixing, and then basically people came along with pails, got their messes portion of it, took it back to the mess to be issued, and when they were issuing it, they might have done a little like the old thumb in there to sort of like display some of the volume when they're pouring out everybody else's, and oh look, there's a little extra left. That's mine, type of thing. So there's a great book, the James Pack book. I'm forgetting the name of it. Nelson's Blood. I'm sure, Mitch knows it. Nelson's Blood is full of some great stories like that. So if you haven't read it, it's highly worth. If you love this stuff, it's full of stories. It's not the most narratively amazing book, but in terms of facts and history, it's chock full of good stuff. So
wonderful. Matt, thank you so much for tonight. I think, this has been such a wonderful way to start Black Tot Rum Club. I hope everyone that's been watching has enjoyed these amazing stories that Matt's been researching over the past couple of years. I'm very, very thankful to Matt and all his rum writing on CocktailWonk especially. So if you're finding this video through Black Tot, please go and follow CocktailWonk and make sure you go and read everything that Matt's ever written, because it's wonderful. And if you're finding us through CocktailWonk, please come and check us out. We're going to be doing this pretty much every week we can until we're allowed to travel again and do this in person with you all. And we look forward to having.
We should do this as the traveling roadshow.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's really been an honor, Matt. Like you're one of my rum heroes, so it's wonderful to be able to do this with you. And guys, I hope everyone who's watching, thank you so much. So many of you have been staying for the whole video. Please, if you have any more questions, put them in the comments. Let us know. If there's anyone you want to see on Black Tot Rum Club, add them into the comments. We'll try and get them on for you so we can all share a rum together. I look forward to seeing you all again next week. So, Matt, thank you so much for everything you're doing for the rum.
A pleasure. Thank you for having me on. It's an honor.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.